Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and today on the Roundup, we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the past week and a half. And as we do each week, we take our news stories from our newsletter that comes out on Mondays called All the SMIE News Fit to Share. That comes out on Mondays. It has questions, or has news stories on social media. It has news stories on international ed news from the United States and around the world. And we bring that to you on Mondays and then take the themes that we see running through a lot of those news stories, and we go a little bit next level here on the Roundup, more in depth with our thoughts on how these stories impact what we do in international education, particularly here in the United States. So as we do each week, we take those news stories and we answer these questions. First up, as we do each week, I always drop copies of the most recent edition of the newsletter into the chat. You can also find all the past editions on our website at smieconsulting.org/subscribe. You can also get a copy of the most recent edition on the newsletter here on the live chat on Facebook and on our YouTube channel. And then we will post the links to the other stories that we cover along with the links to the newsletters in the chat on Twitter and LinkedIn shortly after this session ends at 1:30. So for those of you who are on LinkedIn, if you'd like to get your newsletter and work-related professional development kind of content in on your notifications each week, you can subscribe to that. We actually have over 700 subscribers to the newsletter on LinkedIn, and an additional almost 100 from our website. So we encourage you to sign up and get that content delivered direct to you each Monday morning, and then by the time Wednesday afternoon rolls around, you'll have a chance to get a sense on what we might be covering on our topics for the Roundup. So our first question of the day is, are you practicing social listening as you recruit? Now, if your job role is not specific into social media, this might not have any relevance to you whatsoever, but let me kind of paint the broader picture for you. When it comes to how our prospective student audiences get information these days, it's not too much of a stretch to say that they're getting it online. They're getting it from social media. And in a number of different formats, a number of different platforms all around the world. And part of that, part of those guiding principles I've always worked under when it comes to how to connect with students on social media, but also more broadly in terms of just general approaches to what we do in international education, international student recruitment, is to live where your audiences live. And that guiding principle means spending time in the spaces, on the platforms, in the locations where they are spending their time, where your target audience is spending their time. And those locations will vary depending on where you are in the world, what part of the world you're trying to target, what student groups you're looking for, what countries they're from. So knowing those platforms, where you need to be spending your time, where they are spending their time, is probably the most important piece in student recruitment when you're talking about evaluating strategies and tools that will help you get you in front of your target audiences, and then allow you to develop messaging that's appropriate for those audiences that will resonate with them and lead to eventual applications and enrollments. Kind of basic standard recruitment marketing. So the next step after that, really, when I think about what's most important when you are on those platforms where you are trying to have the conversation, is to do something that sometimes for admissions folks is a little bit hard to do, and that's listen. We're always keen to ask the right questions and make sure we're presenting the right information about our institutions, but how often do we spend the time actually listening to what our audience is saying about us, whether to our face in those conversations online or in general? What are they saying about you, or what are they saying to you? And this is something that I think is vital to any successful long-term social media marketing strategy when it comes to international student recruitment, is having an element of your strategy that revolves around social listening. Now, there are a lot of different tools out there that help you get there. But I want to give a shout out to the folks at WebCertain. They've got a guide to social listening for international marketers that I've dropped the link to in the chat on Facebook and YouTube. And again, we'll do likewise from our to our LinkedIn and Twitter feeds later today. But all these stories, as we do each week, are coming from our newsletter. So if you've already gotten that edition, you'll have seen the links to these stories. But this social listening piece is key. And I emphasize that for a number of different reasons, because you need to know what's out there, what you can afford. Some are free, some are freemium, some are a little bit more cost prohibitive, perhaps, for smaller offices. But if not your office, certainly your marketing office on campus should have some elements of social listening built into what they do in terms of tracking how your brand, how your institution is being talked about out in the wider world on social media and online. So what I like about this WebCertain guide is it covers a number of different things that will help you kind of focus in on what's going to be important for your institution. In terms of some of the more popular social listening platforms like Hootsuite, Mention, and Buffer, and others like that. But also things, how to set it up, and what keywords you want to be tracking beyond your institutional name. And then what are the key metrics that you can really measure your success with when it comes to social listening and getting a sense of what your audiences are really saying. And then how to integrate, the key is, obviously, is the fact that you are listening is great, but figuring out what your audiences are saying about you, and then how you can turn that into messaging that's going to be more relevant to them, that's going to preempt a lot of the questions that they have had about your institution, and it helps you to focus in your marketing efforts, particularly if you're seeing trends in certain countries that can help you identify, well, we need to be doing customized content for this country because we're seeing all these questions about this topic. So this will help you understand that this is an audience that cares specifically about, let's say, for example, post-study work. There are certain countries where it is absolutely top of the list in terms of priorities for students before they make decisions on which country they're going to study in. So if you have social listening data that's capturing what the conversation is for your target audience in that country that might be looking at your institution, and you can say, okay, they're really keen on finding out what jobs are available for graduates after they're done with a degree. They're looking for what the internships are that can help them build their resumes before they start applying for jobs post-study completion. So all of that can be very, very useful to you as you kind of want to connect more directly and on levels and on particular platforms and on particular messages that are keenly important to your target audiences. So that's the whole idea behind social listening. And it's a concept that it does take some work, and it's also takes some time to get it right, and we have to make refinements. And I know I can share similar stories. Any road warriors out there in the international admissions world who've gone overseas to college fairs and who maybe have if it's their first time in a market, you might have difficulty picking up on accents and certain phrasings that students might use in given markets. So it's important for you to kind of say, oh, what did you say? How did you say? And you kind of have to pick up on those kind of the cues that they give you on what they're actually saying, kind of putting the words into context, the rest of what they're saying into context for whatever phrase you might not have gotten. So you might need to have some follow-up questions just to make sure you're understanding before you answer. And that's what social listening is in reality, is you're hearing what the questions are, what the topics are that they're concerned with. You're figuring out, okay, they are particularly concerned about this here. Here's what I need to respond. Here's how you need to respond, and that helps you better prepare your responses. So that listening piece is very important, rather than just spurting out the line about here's our admission deadlines, here's our admissions process, here's how we make decisions, here's what scholarship information is, and here are our top majors, when that might not be the answer that they're really looking for. So it's really important that you maybe read between the lines, so to speak, when you're hearing a message for the first time, is what are they really after? So that's what social listening can help you get to. And feel free to download that web certain guide because it certainly will provide you a lot of important how-tos and how to get started on that front. But social listening is an important element, and I'd be curious to find out from our audience how many of you are actually using social listening when you're recruiting international students in terms of social media listening. So that's our first question of the day. Let's move on to number 2. We go from something fairly small and niche but very critical to eventual enrollment success, like social listening, to something that is a much bigger picture issue, and that is our second question of the day. Can the West counter China's Belt and Road Initiative? And this is a concept we've talked about the Belt and Road Initiative many, many times here on the Roundup in terms of the impact that it has had on the developing world and why it's initially started, what the end result of the China's Belt and Road Initiative has been, of the impact it's had on countries where these infrastructure projects have been completed, and what the end goal of this from China's perspective was to be their version of the Marshall Plan, so to speak, post-World War II, for example, where U.S. was funding a lot of projects around Europe to help rebuild Europe after World War II. That China had seen, obviously, U.S. soft power, U.S. influence in the world after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. You saw it become almost a unipolar world instead of a bipolar world between the First World and Second World of the Western world of democracies and the Second World of the communist controlled governments. So that, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, China, their economy in the 90s hadn't developed as quickly as it has. It's in the early 2000s, but you've seen China in the early 2000s kind of realize we need to be doing more to counter this unipolar world where the U.S. has been reigning supreme. And what they've done is they rolled out the Belt and Road Initiative in the late 90s to be its version of it's supposed to be this old Silk Road, the Belt and Road that connected the West to the East initially, that ran through Central Asia and into Europe. That remaking of that road to literally build infrastructure projects in South Asia, into Africa, and even into some places in Europe. You've seen China's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, spend literally billions upon billions, up to over $1 trillion over the years, over the last decade or so, on these kind of infrastructure projects. And there's a couple articles I'll be posting here. One is from Fox Business that details some of the different kinds of projects and the impacts that they have had. The West is alleging that China's Belt and Road Initiative traps countries in debt due to these infrastructure projects that they've rolled out across the world, in the developing world in particular. They're actually since 2013, it was a 10-year, multi-trillion-dollar effort that involves development and infrastructure programs in more than 100 countries aimed at creating a modern version of the ancient Silk Road trade from Asia to Europe, as I was talking about earlier. This is from this Fox Business article. Now, the G7, and why the question today is, should or can the West counter China's Belt and Road Initiative? Well, when you look at just the sheer amount of money that's been spent over the last decade, you see multi-trillions of dollars spent by China in over 100 countries to build infrastructure, but also to curry favor with governments. And in what the reality has been, a lot of these countries that said, oh, Chinese dollars to build infrastructure projects for airports and highways and trains and all of these things, 5G networks, whatever it might be, those have been welcomed, but they come with a price tag. And those loans are being held by China over these countries. And we don't know, we haven't seen necessarily what the consequences of countries who have taken these Chinese yuan or RMB to fund their infrastructure projects that are built by Chinese companies and such. You see now the G7 had actually started something last June 2021. It was called back then the Build Back Better World Initiative. B3W was it was shortened to, and that was coming out of kind of Joe Biden's presidency coming into power, and his initial policy decisions are centered around his Build Back Better plans. However, those did not fare well in the Congress. So that B3W globally has been rebranded to a Partnership for Global Infrastructure is underway. That's what the G7 have agreed to, and that's basically G7, for those who aren't familiar, the 7 leading Western economies teaming up to act together in kind of in contrast to what China has done and other world issues of the day. That China is the world power that other than Russia. China's footprint is certainly much larger than Russia is. Russia is obviously a major irritant in Europe with European allies and that region, but as we know, the knock-on effects of what the war in Ukraine has done to the world economy that was already looking sluggish and moving into an inflationary period that has now mushroomed into potentially a global recession. But we'll see what happens on that front. But the G7 pledged $200 billion, the U.S. pledged $200 billion to this G7 infrastructure project to counter China's multi-trillion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative. So it was relaunched this past week when the G7 leaders met in southern Germany. And the G7 leaders pledged to raise $600 billion in private and public funds over 5 years to finance needed infrastructure projects in developing countries. So the U.S. portion is coming from grants, federal funds, and private investment over that time, and then $600 million hopefully from the other 6 G7 countries. That we could have, and this could be the start of something much larger. But the goal is really through this pledge from the G7 to counter clearly what BRI has done through China over the last 10 years. So that Western officials have long argued that the Belt and Road Initiative traps receiving countries in debt with investments that benefit China more than their hosts. Just in terms of financial gain and soft power gains, what we're seeing, one of the first initiatives is a $2 billion solar farm investment in Angola in Southwest Africa, $320 million for hospital construction in Ivory Coast, and $40 million to promote regional energy trade in Southeast Asia. And European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said the G7 is offering sustainable quality infrastructure and will be listening closely to the recipient countries. Now, one of my colleagues, when he saw my tweet about this yesterday, or the day, I think it was yesterday, he thought back and said, isn't this like what USAID did for State Department for a number of years, or before it became part of State Department? Wasn't that their mission? And certainly there were infrastructure projects that were part of USAID, but certainly I don't think the global purpose was necessarily to indebt these countries to the United States financially. Those things tend to be much smaller scale than certainly what China has done, what the G7 are proposing. Now the challenge is with this, and is kind of a counterpoint to yes, something needs to be done to counter what China's been doing the last 10 years to curry favor with lots of African countries as well as throughout South Asia and other places in the world. But what folks at Foreign Affairs, a particular piece came out this past week, right after the G7 announced the U.S. announced their $200 billion investment in this. The foreign affairs folks come out and say that, well, is this really what is this the right approach to competing with China in the developing world? And the Foreign Affairs article says the U.S. is notoriously bad at investing in and maintaining its own physical infrastructure. No questions, no arguments there. So it's never made sense for it to try and build infrastructure projects abroad. Those activities are best left to the multilateral economic institutions in which the United States plays a leading role, like the World Bank, African Development Bank, that type of thing. So what it should do, if it's looking to counter Chinese progress or advances in world soft power, that its take is that Washington should play to its strengths, which they say are leveraging its unparalleled system of higher education. And that's where the link is to what we do in international ed. It's the case that's made here that the good news is that the schooling the next generation of global leaders, rather than playing catch up with the Chinese construction firms, would be a win, not just for the United States' global standing, but for the U.S. economy as well. That's a quote direct from Foreign Affairs. And we're talking about leveraging our unparalleled system of higher education. So I totally agree with that in terms of where that certainly is more in line with what the State Department has always been about in terms of public diplomacy as the main motivation for bringing students from abroad and scholars from abroad to this nation for part of their study, where we found that over a third of world leaders currently spent part of their education in the United States. So this alternative to what China has been doing is we don't necessarily have to go head to head with them on this. That we should be building up our multilateral institutions to provide a positive alternative, as the folks say from Foreign Affairs to this. So it is something that what the G7 are doing, focusing on infrastructure, completely wrong. No, but is it going to be the best investment of resources to help grow relationships with other countries? And that's educating the people that are going to be the leaders of those countries, rather than indebting those leaders to a foreign power, is probably where you'll see and where I think the best chances for long-term success are going to be borne out. So I certainly agree with the foreign affairs piece, rather than the general approach the G7 is taking. So that's our second question for the day. I do want to finish with a talk about a market that to U.S. institutions is often taken for granted, and that is Mexico. It is a top 10 market for U.S. colleges and universities in terms of the source of international students and where they're coming from. And what we'll be referring to first is an article from the PI News last week on where Mexican students are going for studies abroad, if they are choosing to go abroad. That, and also an example of Mexican institutions that are also trying to become a destination for international students. And Institute of Monterrey, their tech in Monterrey is one of the leading institutions, and they're investing $100 million to recruit first world talent to their institution in the form of professors and top students. So there's certainly competition out there. Let's first dive into the PI News article, which says there are clear signs for recruitment growth in Mexico. So that's basically for students, and the lead from this PI News article, this is coming out of a BMI study, the 2022 BMI Mexico Market Report, and there's a link to that in the PI News article that I've shared the link to. And it says that before the pandemic, Canada and Australia had experienced steady growth, with the U.S. seeing a steady decline at undergraduate level, and the U.K. maintaining a fairly flat enrollment since 2011. But institutions globally can still find recruitment opportunities in the Latin American country, it continued. So that's from the report, paraphrasing from that BMI Mexico Market Report. So what it is sharing is that Mexican students are as a strong international education market as a source of students. It says it is growing, But there's also an appetite from the report, an appetite for adventure and global curiosity. That there are factors that are motivating Mexican students to go abroad are affordability, employment opportunities during and after studies, and immigration pathways. And that has what has led to Mexican students looking for alternatives to traditional destinations that might be seen as less than favorable on the work end and affordability end. So the U.S. has always been a strong source of students just for geographical reasons. There's a lot of cross-border student flows from Mexico to the U.S. For colleges and universities along the border, but they've gone all over the U.S. as well. But over the last 8 or 9 years, only 5 states have seen enrollment growth from Mexico: Alabama, Georgia, Idaho, Nevada, and Utah. So representing UNLV, as I have done for the last couple of months, that is certainly borne out in terms of growth in student populations, either from Mexico or visa students coming to that state. Certainly that data certainly merges and jibes with what that is saying. So what is interesting to see, though, where the other students that might have been coming to the U.S. previously are going now. Some of that was Trump-related, as to why those flows have ended since 2014. But it now looks at enrollment looking to the National Association of Universities and Higher Education Institutions in Spanish. Total university enrollment in the country has nearly doubled in the last 13 years, and that's in Mexico. So that's gone from 2.5 million in 2007-8 to almost 5 million in 2020-21. That's a 97% increase. So huge increases in the number of Mexican students beginning higher education studies, and then as a result of increasing number that are either not getting into their first choice institutions in Mexico, much like happens in other parts of the world, that are also looking to go abroad and to find university options in other countries. So we see there are scholarships that help send Mexican students abroad, offering 110 postgrad scholarships in 2020 from a group called FUND, F-U-N-E-D. Australia has seen some growth there. Canada has steady enrollment growth since 2014. That doctoral degrees in the U.S. And France, oddly enough, have maintained steady growth since 2014. And Canada, as we said, Australia has grown as well. New Zealand has also seen, and Ireland have seen growth, but more in the vocational sector. But we see at secondary school level, New Zealand and Ireland are beating Australia to the punch there. So New Zealand's English language sector is the only one to have shown consistent growth in Mexican enrollment year on year. So that's curious, and I wonder how that's been impacted by the pandemic as well, since New Zealand has suffered quite a bit. So one of the BMI main takeaways was many Mexican students are looking to non-Spanish speaking countries as their study destination because it provides them with a well-rounded experience that includes language immersion and greater cultural differences. That's interesting that happens, the language immersion and greater cultural differences. That's saying they're looking at non-Spanish speaking countries. But there are also large groups of Mexican students that are studying in Spain and other Latin American countries like Colombia and Argentina, which tend to enroll a high number of international students from Mexico. So we see quite a dynamic market in Mexico, probably more so than we give them credit for in the United States, at least. So it's one that's a market that's certainly worth understanding, and I know there are a few groups that do study tours down there through ApplyWave and a couple others. So there are definitely ways to get into that market if you aren't already. But we certainly it's a market you just can't go in expecting to get students all of a sudden. You have to develop relationships and leverage existing relationships that you have on campus to make those future students see value in coming to your institution. So that's all we have for you today on the Midweek Roundup. And as we say each week, it's always a pleasure getting to hear from you and getting your feedback on some of these news stories and our thoughts. And we look forward to connecting with you in the weeks and months to come. Just a quick note, our next Midweek Roundup will be coming to you live from the International ACAC ACAC Conference. I'm thinking about the dodgeball tournament that happens there. But we'll be live on Wednesday from that conference. We'll be live just on Facebook, so we won't be able to, we'll have rebroadcasts of that on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. But we hope you'll join us next week, where we'll be hopefully interviewing some international educators that are attending that conference at the University of New Mexico next week. So until then, we wish you all the very best and take care. Cheers.